Welcome back to the audio recording of Jesus' Bible by Christopher Dost. Why this book? Just from the sources in the bibliography, one can see that there is no shortage of books that address the origins and development of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. So why this book? Most of the students that I teach are evangelical Christians who are preparing or further equipping themselves for one type of ministry or another. Many of them have, in the course of their higher education, studied the Bible in a non-confessional, that is to say a non-religious way, often to fulfill one of their undergraduate religion or literature requirements. At most colleges and universities, such courses teach mainstream scholarly approaches to the scriptures, such as those discussed in the following chapters, and many of my seminary-level students have learned to read the Bible according to these approaches before they ever stepped foot in my classroom. It is my job to continue to educate them in scholarly methods and perspectives while also helping them to think critically about what it all means for their faith commitment. Much of what is written in this book has arisen from discussions that have taken place with students inside and outside of my classroom. As for my students who have not taken such courses, most of them have been introduced to the perspectives of mainstream biblical scholarship through the media, whether by watching a History Channel documentary that questions the historical accuracy of the Old Testament's narrative, a New York Times op-ed that raises doubts as to whether the book of Leviticus initially proscribed male homosexuality or not, or perhaps an interview with New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman on The Daily Show that addresses the role scribes played in adding material to biblical texts. So all of my students, in one way or another, have encountered mainstream biblical scholarship prior to commencing their formal studies. Some of these aforementioned media productions are responsible treatments of this difficult subject matter and do a fantastic job of informing the general public of the problems that biblical scholars face in reconstructing the history of the Bible. Others, however, are more sensationalist in nature and thus much less useful. Addressing the extensive sensationalist media attention given to the Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance, Schiffman laments that such productions have tended to invert reality and that the media ultimately misshape public perception. The media can do as much bad as good. It is not only the sensationalist media productions that are to blame for misperceptions of the Hebrew Bible's origins and development, however. There are a number of popular works on this subject written by authors who have not been trained in biblical studies at an advanced level, whose respective works exhibit limited awareness of biblical scholarship and do more to reinforce common misunderstandings about the Bible than to introduce the reader to what is actually known. One of the better works that fit this category is Philip Yancey's The Bible Jesus Read. Yancey's aim is to encourage Christians to read the Hebrew Bible and to grow an appreciation for the way in which its millennia-old content can still impact readers today. In my estimation, Yancey does well to invite the reader into a dialogue with the Hebrew Scriptures, but there are three aspects of the book that are of concern. First, to call the Hebrew Bible, the Bible Jesus read, is not entirely accurate, as I have already indicated. There was no Bible in Jesus' day. The Torah and the prophets, the first two sections of what would become the Hebrew Bible, were essentially canonized, that is to say, accepted as authoritative, but they were still textually fluid. The third section, however, the writings, was not fixed. Thus, there was no Bible. Second, understanding Jesus' Bible is just as much an investigation into how Jesus read as it is of what he read, a subject that Yancey barely touches. The third aspect of this work that raises alarm concerns method. Before giving an interpretation of a text, it is important that the interpreter follow a reliable method or a procedure that allows him or her to confidently interpret the biblical text under consideration. Yancey notes in the preface that he is not interested in or qualified to evaluate scholarly investigations of the dating and authorship of biblical books, preferring instead to read the Bible from a lay perspective. I admire Yancey for his honesty, and I do believe that he generally reads the translated Hebrew Bible in a responsible fashion. Yet one of my principal reasons for writing this work is that the matters that Yancey has decided to avoid are essential for producing a reliable interpretation of any biblical text and are necessary for reconstructing the history of the Hebrew Scriptures. This unfortunate state of affairs is further exacerbated by the fact that those who are competent to write such works do not do so because their institution does not reward faculty for engaging with the broader public and/or because they are afraid of the backlash that they could face from their institution's administration and constituency, finding it safer to keep quiet than to share knowledge with those outside of the field. Therefore, many non-specialists who are interested in learning about the Bible's origins do not know where to turn for a fair, non-sensationalized treatment of the material. In fact, many of my religiously conservative students have expressed to me their frustration over the Church's failure to discuss these other perspectives and to engage with those who hold them. There was a time when conservative Christianity could bury its proverbial head in the sand, but that time is long past. While the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, may be a very ancient anthology, written at a time and in a place very distant from the reader's own, understanding its origins and its message is immensely important even in the 21st century for political and cultural reasons. As I have indicated above, this dialogue does not only take place within academic institutions. A fairly recent History Channel documentary raises the question of whether the Old Testament can be taken as literal truth and explains that how one answers the question has bearings on one's views on human origins, sexuality, and abortion. Ultimately, this book's objective is to help the non-specialist better understand what the Hebrew Scriptures looked like in their various permutations before they became the Hebrew Bible in the Middle Ages. It is intended to be a concise presentation of the breadth of scholarship that deals with the history of the transmission of the Hebrew Bible with the aim of helping the non-specialist to become acquainted with many important scholarly works and their contributions. The bibliography covers a wide range of scholarly opinion, from the ultra-liberal to the ultra-conservative. It is my hope that presenting a cross-section of the field of scholarship will also equip the reader to more profitably engage with scholarship and those who hold views different from his or her own. Outline of the book. The principal concern of this book is to survey the history of the Hebrew Scriptures from the earliest phases of composition in the late 2nd millennium BCE through the 10th century CE, when the final form of the Hebrew Bible, the one that is most commonly used today, was completed. Over the course of this book's 8 chapters, we will consider why there was more than one accepted version of the Hebrew Scriptures in Jesus' day, and how the versions differ from the received Hebrew text found in most modern printed editions. In Chapter 1, the Masoretic text, I introduce the reader to the Tiberian Masoretic Hebrew Bible, the Bible that most have in mind when they refer to the original Hebrew. This is for most traditions the final form and the textus receptus, Latin for received text, of the Hebrew Bible. Chapters 2 through 5 explore 4 areas of research that shed light on the Hebrew Bible's origins and growth. Chapter 2 briefly sketches the different phases of biblical Hebrew and how analysis of the Hebrew of a given text can provide clues as to when and where the text was written. Chapter 3 considers the historical reliability of the Hebrew Scriptures and their use for reconstructing ancient Israel's past. I compare what the Hebrew Bible says about Israel and Judah's past with what scholars consider to be true as a result of textual and archaeological investigation. This overview of Israelite and Judean history will be of use in more reliably locating the authors, editors, and copyists of Scripture within the broader history of the biblical people. In Chapter 4, I consider the implications that reading the Hebrew Bible as ancient Near Eastern literature has for establishing the date and provenance, that is, place of origin, of biblical texts. Chapter 5 explores scribal culture in the ancient Near East and the light it can shed on ancient Israelite scribal practices and text production. In Chapter 6, I turn to the question of who wrote the Hebrew Bible, comparing traditional assumptions about the authors of the Hebrew Scriptures with the results of scholarly inquiry. Chapters 7 and 8 discuss the two most important ancient translations of the Hebrew Bible, the Aramaic Targums and the Septuagint. These two chapters explore the reasons for translating the Hebrew Scriptures, the nature of those translations, and what they reveal about the state of the biblical text and its interpretation in Jesus' day. The book then closes with a brief conclusion. Presentation. Before moving on to the first chapter, I would like to say a few words about this book's style of presentation. First, because the book is intended for a broader audience, I avoid using technical vocabulary as much as possible. When it is necessary to use shop talk, I explain technical terms in parentheses or in footnotes. I also refrain from abbreviating the names of biblical books, since some readers may be less familiar than others with the contents of the Bible. Finally, in keeping with my stated aim, I include in this work numerous references to the sources that I have used in preparing this work. Typically, books written for a broader audience tend to cite sources only sparsely. I have decided to make constant reference to scholarly sources so that the reader may know where to continue the investigation of a topic about which he or she desires to learn more.